when I was 16, he actually had his fatal heart attack in the middle of the night. And I was a lifeguard at the time. So I ran into the room. I realized what was happening and I administered CPR. And I failed. When you can be the parent you would have needed, right? That was able to do what you didn't get without necessarily throwing shade on your own parents. But if you didn't get something you needed, right? They did the best they could with the tools they had. Their tools were inadequate. So you're going to be that parent to your own child, you heal. Like your inner child actually heals from that.
Welcome to Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. I'm Chana Weisberg, host of this podcast. I'm really excited to have today a special guest. Her name is Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, and she is a clinical psychologist. She is a parenting expert, and she is a post-traumatic parent. She is also the author of the newly published book called Post-Traumatic Parenting, Breaking the Cycle and Becoming the Parent You Want to Be. Thank you so much for joining us, Robyn.
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to talk about this.
So can you tell us, first of all, what do you do? A little about what you do.
So first, I just want to say the book is not out yet. It's available for pre-order, but it's coming out in July of 25, which is getting there.
Amazing. Yes.
Yeah. So I am a clinical psychologist. I work with parents, families, and kids. And my big area of expertise is how, when parents feel blocked in their parenting, how perhaps their own traumas, whether in childhood or whether in adulthood, like I say, after COVID, we're all post-traumatic parents. So, but how does that block us from following all this parenting advice? You know, you read a parenting book and you just want to follow all the advice and do all the things. And then you find yourself yelling, or you find yourself, spacing out or getting stressed out. Like, perhaps it's not you. Perhaps it's your trauma, and perhaps we can do something about that.
And what I found so interesting about you is that a lot of the reasons why you went into the research is because of your background. Can you tell us a little about what you personally went through?
So I myself am a post-traumatic parent. So as a child, I was raised in a home with two wonderful parents, but my father was very sick. So, it wasn't unusual in my house that, EMS would be at our house because he was having an episode. He was having a heart attack. There was a lot of medical drama. He was also chronically ill with his heart condition. So he was very low energy. There were times of extreme stress. And finally, and this is a trigger warning for anybody listening, this is a difficult story to hear, but when I was 16, he actually had his fatal heart attack in the middle of the night. And I was a lifeguard at the time. So I ran into the room, I realized what was happening, and I administered CPR. And I failed because I didn't know this, but he was already past saving at that point. And that situation left me with PTSD. But this was way back in the early 90s when we really didn't know about PTSD. So I was pretty sure that I was mentally ill, that, I sort of self-diagnosed. So we had a relative who used to sometimes come to our house for meals because he actually was a dually diagnosed patient. He had schizophrenia and he was living in a state psychiatric facility, but every so often he would get, he would be a little better and he would get leave and he would come to our house. And so I knew what schizophrenia looked like. So I assumed that, I'm seeing things that aren't there. I'm hearing things that aren't there. It must be that I'm, schizophrenic, and like I'll end up in a mental institution. And like my poor mother, like she loses her husband. And, I had 3 married brothers, and now her only daughter is going to be in a mental institution. Like, poor thing. So I didn't want to tell her, even though my mother was an incredibly wise and kind person who herself was a guidance counselor and probably could have helped me. But I just didn't want to burden her with it. So I had no idea that what I was having were actually flashbacks.
So this is when you're in your teens.
This is when I was in my teens. Yeah. And, in school, and, I went to a Beis Yaakov school. We had a guidance counselor. She was not at all mental health trained, and she was a lovely person, right? She was a lovely, helpful, kind lady. But when I would start explaining to her these flashbacks, she would want me to pray them away, or she would want me to think positive thoughts. I keep a gratitude journal. Like, all of these things were lovely, But I actually had something called PTSD, and I was having something called flashbacks, and I needed psychological help from a mental health professional who could recognize what I had.
Mhm.
And she couldn't do that as much as she loved me. She didn't know what she didn't know. Right.
Mhm.
So without being angry with her, I can say she did the best she could with the tools she had, but the tools were very inadequate. So when I went to, undergrad school at that point, I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, but I didn't know yet that PTSD was a thing. I remember when the professor spoke about PTSD for the first time, and I said, like, wait a minute. He told that famous story of the Vietnam vet who came home and a car backfired. And unfortunately, he thought he was under enemy fire in Vietnam and he shot his wife.
Oh, wow.
And he was explaining the immersive nature of a flashback. And I remember sort of raising my hand and just saying, like, is it only from war or could it be anything really scary? So he's like, "What do you mean really scary?" I said, like maybe witnessing someone die, being part of
Mm.
somebody's death, like with that. And he said, "Yeah, that would do it." And I said, "Oh,
Wow.
I think that's what I have." So for me, so that was one thing, like the fact that I had PTSD and that none of my grown-ups recognized it, right? There
Mm.
was no one, and there was no one I could relate to that really could help me. Right. There was
Is it because it wasn't so common in those days? I mean, you look like you're so young, but you're not so young.
I'm
You
not
you
too
have
young. I'm a
married
grandmother
children.
times 6, yeah.
Exactly.
So,
But
yeah.
is it because, years ago there wasn't this kind of information? It wasn't so widely spread. People didn't know about
Yeah,
PTSD so
there was
much?
a stigma, right? There certainly
Mhm.
was, like, mental health treatment was the kind of thing, that people didn't really talk about.
Mhm.
I think also PTSD in particular, until Bessel van der Kolk wrote The Body Keeps the Score, trauma
Mhm.
was not talked about. He did not write that book. Maybe I'm wrong, but like until like 2002 or so, like it was
Mhm.
way after my story.
Mhm.
So no one
Mhm.
talked about trauma. And remember, Google didn't exist. Like I'm the last
Mhm.
generation of parents who grew up with no internet. The internet pretty much started to be widespread when I was in, I would say, my first year of college, right?
Mhm.
So
Right.
it's not like I could Google it, right? Google
Right.
wasn't a thing as a verb, right? It was a
Right.
number.
Right.
So yeah, and there was just
What
no
well, what
information.
kind of what kind of things were you feeling? I mean, were you getting flashbacks of your father passing away? Like, what was it
So
like for you?
so
And it
unfortunately,
must have been very scary as a teenager having those kind of feelings.
it was terrifying because again, mental health was a stigma, so I needed to pretend to be perfect and normal, right? So
Mhm.
but yeah, so right after my father died, actually, a classmate of mine, a grade younger than me, also died. She died of an aneurysm in class. And I
Oh,
was the
wow.
only person who recognized that what was happening. Like I started screaming, the teachers were standing around saying things like, "Oh, does she have her period? Did she eat anything?" And I'm
Mhm.
like, "She's not breathing." Like I was just at that stage. I
Mhm.
remember shoving a secretary. I was like, "Go call right now. Call 911. We need help. Like go." And I was like ordering everybody around. You go downstairs and like wait for the EMS and bring them up to the classroom. And like I was just like directing the scene because I had seen death and I knew that I heard like there was no one home behind her eyes. She wasn't breathing, but her heart was still beating. And I was like literally the first responder on the scene. I was just a lifeguard. And then she was in a coma for a couple of weeks and then she died. So those two incidents sort of became conflated in my head because they were very close
Mhm.
together. And unfortunately, my school was in, a busy urban area. We were in Brooklyn, so there were sirens all the time. And my brain somehow conflated the sirens of
Mhm.
her emergency story with my father's, even though my father died in the middle of the night and there were no sirens. But I would hear
Mhm.
a siren, which in my school was all the time, and I would have a flashback. Or
Mhm.
I would suddenly have like a tactile flashback where I would just sort of feel myself pressing my father's chest. I would taste his breath, like when I was giving the rescue breaths. But suddenly I'd be sitting in chemistry class and all of a sudden I'd be in my father's bedroom. Like it was like
Mhm.
superimposed one scene over the other, which was very freaky. And nowadays we have the concept of like a 3D theater, right? Like an immersive
Mhm.
experience. But back then I really did think I was crazy. But
Mhm.
I call it being a duck, right? And I say this to traumatized kids all the time. I volunteer a lot and I work a lot with organizations for kids who are undergoing trauma. It's like being a duck, right? Like over the surface of the water, the duck looks so serene and they look fine. And then under the surface, their legs are paddling madly, like trying to keep up. And that's what it feels like. So when, I'll talk to girls who are like, the head of their student council and their head of dance in their high school play, and they're going for these prestigious scholarships, and they lost a parent and they have PTSD, or they didn't lose a parent, they have PTSD from something else. And they're like, yes, that's exactly what it's like. And if you think about it, like Freud has this definition of health, of to love, to live, and to work. I was loving, living, and working, but I was so
Mm.
not psychologically healthy, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's very hard because now, of course, we know so much about trauma. But
Mhm.
back then we really didn't, and we certainly didn't ask for help. Like the stigma of speaking to a mental health professional was just like that just didn't happen,
Right, wow. You also went through, like, a very I mean, you're a religious woman, you're a
right?
Torah observant woman, and you went through all the schooling, and this is at a time when not so many women were going into these fields. How did it affect you as a Torah observant woman? Did you feel that there was a disconnect between what you were studying and what you knew to be as far as Torah study is, or was there no disconnect?
I didn't There wasn't a disconnect in terms of like what I was learning, because I feel like everything can be interpreted in light of your own sort of lodestone of what the truth is and your own values, right? And if you really have a strong sense of self and you know what you believe and you're well versed in what you believe and what you think, then learning something that's different than that is just like, oh, so that's how you see it. Okay, like that's your
Mhm,
metaphor. I happen
mhm,
to believe all psychotherapy and all everything that we do, it's all metaphors. Right?
mhm,
Even the word thought, like when someone says, "Oh, I'm having a thought is a metaphor for what's actually happening in your brain, right? There are
mhm,
molecules that are releasing chemicals that are making it happen. We call that thing a thought, right? It's just a
mhm,
metaphor, a way for humans to place understanding on an experience that really is a little ineffable. So this is your metaphor. It just
mhm,
happens not to be mine, right? So
mhm,
that's sort of the way I always navigated that. I think it was harder to navigate the social pressures, right? Of being, I don't shake hands with men, right? And being
mhm.
able to explain that. Or, no, I'm not
Ha
going to come out with you guys to this club. It's just not I was heavily pregnant anyway most of the time in grad school, so it wasn't going to happen, but like not my milieu.
Uh-huh. Right, wow. So how did you explain you can't shake hands?
So I learned it took me time because by nature I'm somewhat of a people pleaser. But I learned how to, like, first of all, not apologize because I'm not actually sorry. Right.
Mhm,
So I used to say I'm sorry, right? And now it was just like, for religious reasons, I don't shake hands with men. I hope you can respect that, right?
mhm,
One time I had this very funny experience where I was at a conference and I said to this man, he came to shake my hand to tell me he liked my talk. And I said, "Oh, for religious reasons, I don't shake hands with men. I hope that doesn't offend you," or whatever terminology I used. And he's like, "Actually, it does offend me." And he started giving me this lecture about feminism. And then he finishes his whole, like, speech. And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, "Thank you for mansplaining feminism to me. My body, my choice, not gonna shake your hand," right?
Right,
And so many people came over to me afterwards, like, in appreciation for what I did, right? In the sense that if you are a feminist, my body, my choice. I have
right,
to consent for you to touch me. I do not consent for you to touch me. That is the most feminist thing in the world. It also happens to be the most religious thing in the world. It's my understanding of feminism, right?
right. Exactly,
So
100%.
he was so startled, right? Like, just, I can answer you in your terminology, but this is my body and I believe in the dignity of my body, right? And I'm
Mhm.
not going to change my mind because you think something's polite or you think something's outdated. You're
Mhm.
entitled to your opinion.
Absolutely. Right, 100%. But yet it was also your background as a religious Torah observant Jew that made you wanna get your degree in psychology and help others who are in similar situations because you felt that you need to have some of that value system, that value part of understanding their background.
I very much wanted to be the grown up I would have needed when I was going through what I
Mhm,
went through. And to
mhm,
this day, that's the most rewarding part of my job. Like, I go into a lot of schools and I consult and I do social and emotional learning and we talk about bullying and all these kinds of things. And sometimes I have a kid come up to me and say, like, "You're the only person who made this make sense to me." Like, people make these, I
mhm,
call it like tricky comments, when a girl, because of course girls are allowed to be as mean as they want as long as they're nice, right? That's like the famous kind
mhm.
of Rosalind Wiseman's research. So, when someone says, like, "Oh, I love your glasses. My uncle has the same pair." And I just never knew how to answer it. And I call that a tricky comment. And that's a tricky bully. And I teach them how to handle that. Like, everyone just says, "Just ignore them. You're the first person who told me what to do. Like, thank you." And I just remember thinking, like, Yeah, I'm the grown up I would have needed. When I was a very traumatized little girl and I was super shy, I would have needed someone like me to tell me how you answer a comment like that because I didn't know.
Mhm.
Right? And I think that is the essence of healing for all of us, whether, and that's a lot in my book, right? That when you can be the parent you would have needed, right? That was able to do what you didn't get without necessarily throwing shade on your own parents, but if you didn't get something you needed, right? They did the best they could with the tools they had. Their tools were inadequate. So you're going to be that parent to your own child, you heal.
Mhm.
Like your inner
Mhm.
child actually heals from that.
Hmm. Wow, I love how you're not blaming anybody. You're not blaming anybody. You're saying that they all did the best that they could, but you're
Most
actually
people, right? I mean, I would say
right, right,
99% of people do the best they can.
of course,
Right.
but you're still taking what you've gone through and you're finding, you're because of what you went through, you're finding a certain understanding and a certain way of parenting that is deeper and better.
Parenting is the ultimate healing journey, right? It's not just healthy for our kids, it's healing for us as well. And when we can really consciously parent and make it into like sort of a career, like the thing we're doing mindfully, not just the thing we're doing by default, right? Because a lot of times it happens that, someone becomes a parent and there's a lot of other irons in the fire. Maybe they're working on their career, maybe they're, struggling economically, right? There's a lot going on. Parenting can happen by default. But when we parent from a place of conscious mindfulness and we really put our attention into it, and it doesn't have to be all day and it doesn't have to be hard work. Sometimes it's a 5-second moment of shared joy, right? But when
Mhm,
we're doing that, then automatically um, we start to heal because our inner child says, "Oh yeah, yeah, there is
mhm,
such a thing, right? In giving, we are getting, right? So like sometimes to give is to receive. So if I would have needed someone to recognize how shy I was as a kid and help me with it, when I recognize how shy one of my kids is and help her with it, or one of my students, or one of the kids I consult in one of the schools I consult with, my inner child feels that experience of a wise older adult teaching
mhm.
you how, right? So
I
it's
I
great for all of
I
us.
I really love that, and I love that because I think so much in our generation is so focused on ourselves and what I'm feeling right now and what I'm thinking right now, and I need the healing, and here you're saying, like, direct it into action for another person, and when you do, you'll find that healing. I found that
Yes.
so, like, so interesting that
Yeah.
you're not focused on just like, okay, talk about what's hurting you, talk about your trauma, talk about what you went through. You're just saying, do an action, and that action is gonna heal you.
Yeah, and on my YouTube channel, I actually have a meditation where that you do where you sort of clue your inner child in to the fact that you're about to give your real world children the thing that the inner child didn't get. And it's like my most watched video. People just, watch it and watch it and watch it because it really, really works. Because sometimes your inner child gets a little jealous of your real world children. Like
Mm,
when I was a young mother, my husband was a young, healthy guy, right? And I was not used to that. I was used to like my archetype of what is a father? He's in bed and sick. He's a
mm,
wise old man, right? My father was what my parents had me at a very, very, very late stage of their marriage. So my father was older than like my friends' fathers. And my husband was a young, energetic guy. So he would come home and we had a bunch of little toddlers and he would be roughhousing with them. And I would be sitting there going like, it's too close to bedtime. You're gonna wake them up. It's time. We have to do homework and bath time and bedtime. Right. And really what was happening was my inner child was so jealous. Like, this is what
wow.
fathers do. They play in this joyful, rough and tumble dad kind of way with their kids, and they're
Mhm,
happy and it's fun, and they don't just, like, sit down and do homework, but when they're doing homework, they make jokes, and the kid jumps up and they run around the table a few times and they high five. It's not just like, "Sit down and do your homework." There's, like, this
right,
whole fun experience. I'm gonna tell you a story, and there's sound effects. I never experienced that simply because
right.
my father was sick and he just didn't have that kind of energy, but my inner child was so jealous. But when I was able to sort of meditate with my inner child and say to my inner child, and I hate meditating, just by the way, I'm not this like meditator, but a
Mm,
meditation to me is just like me and my inner child are going to have a conversation, usually while I'm taking a walk around the block. And I just sort of said to my inner child, like, you're so jealous, you're so sad, you never had this. Right?
mm,
You can be part of this. Like, you can join the game. Like, nothing's stopping you. My inner child at one point said to me, like, well, I want to play too. And I said, okay, you can. Let's go play. right? And it was
Mhm.
such freedom to like join in the roughhousing. And my kids still had bath time and bedtime and supper time, and everything worked just fine. Yeah, it's probably not wise to like rile up an 18-month-old right before bedtime, but like,
Right.
a
Right.
few hours before bedtime is just fine, right? And then I was able to join in the play in a way that just wasn't possible for me when my inner child was so jealous of my real world children.
Wow, but you were conscious of it, like, how did you realize that? Sometimes we don't even realize, like, you could have explained it that you're just being a good mother who doesn't wanna wake up her kids and get them all riled up at that time of day, but you were very conscious to what your inner thinking was all about.
So for a very long time, I was really working on this because I remember when I went to grad school and I was pregnant with my oldest daughter. And I remember going to the stacks at Boop's library and looking for research on how does PTSD impact parenting and impact like a
Mhm.
developing fetus, right? Because and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking like it's so horrible to be inside my body. I had panic attacks and flashbacks all the time. Remember, NYU is also in the middle of Manhattan. A lot of
Mhm.
sirens, right? A lot of loud sudden noises, a lot of stimulation. That does not work well for me. To this day, it doesn't work well for me.
Mhm.
So I was like, it's so horrible to be inside my body, to be me in my body. What's it like to be a baby in my body? This is terrible. And I went to like the stacks and there was no research. Like there was nothing.
Mhm.
But there was
Mhm.
one psychoanalytic paper by a very old psychologist named Selma Freyberg. And I had a professor, she's no longer with us. Her name was Esther Buchholz. She was one of my first mentors. And she clued me in. She's like, you need to read you need to read Freyberg. Like you're talking like real esoteric stuff. You got to go read Freyberg. So I read Freyberg and she wrote this seminal paper called Ghosts in the Nursery, which was all about mothers who are reacting to their own unmet needs and projecting them onto their babies.
Mm.
And that just set me on this path. And then the more I learned about psychotherapy, I remember in grad school feeling like the runt of the litter in my class because I mean, it's NYU. Everybody was very, very bright. Many of them had degrees from like Harvard and Duke, and they were proficient students. But everyone had these like research focuses that were so straight. Like I want to study language development in 4-year olds through a Piagetian lens. Like they knew exactly what they
Right.
were studying. And I was studying children who act out. I was working in a clinic for kids with encopresis and enuresis, kids who lose control of their bowels. I was working in 2 clinics for oppositional kids. And then my research was on child temperament and parenting classes. And like, huh? Like, what's the connection? And
Right.
then it took me so many years to realize I was writing post traumatic parenting. I was looking because guess what? If you're treating oppositional kids who get angry all the time and kids who lose control of their bowels all the time, you're treating trauma, right? And
Mhm.
then
Mhm.
temperament, like what's normal? What's a childhood supposed to be like? What's the normative practices to make a healthy child and to create a healthy childhood? And
Mhm.
that's really so I was conscious of it because I was doing this work. Of course, I was in my own psychotherapy and I was doing this work, and it was just starting to all sort of come together. And then I had this really fortuitous story where I was working in an urban hospital, and I was the parenting class facilitator for this class where if a child had a brush with the law, or even I think a lot of truancy, there was like a certain category that put them into the class, then rather than anybody getting into trouble, the diversion was that the parents could come to a parenting class instead of the kid facing any sort of like major, penalty. So what you ended up having was this cross section of people because in an urban environment, you're going to get people from very high socioeconomic statuses. Like we had someone who was a prosecutor. You're going to get people who are in this country 5 years. You're going to get people from real inner city neighborhoods, right? And everybody's mandated to the same class.
Mhm.
And so I'm teaching this class, and it's a very nice class on like attachment and positive behavioral support and just sort of the basics of parenting temperament, like kids come wired different ways. Very basic, nice class. And one day I said something about a normal childhood. And this mother raises her hand and she said, when I was my daughter's age, I was on a boat here from Honduras, like
Mhm.
eating rats to stay alive. And then I was
Mhm.
working in my cousin's restaurant. Like I would like go to school and then work all night in my cousin's restaurant so that they would let me live there. And then my kid complains to me when I ask her to clean up her toys. Like, I don't know
Right.
what's normal. Like, I was never
Right.
11. And I just
Right.
like stopped in my tracks and I said, that's my question too. I did not have a normal childhood, right? Very different flavor of not normal childhood, but I did not
Right.
have a normal childhood. How many other people in this room have this experience? And every single hand in the room went up,
Mhm.
right? And it was just this moment where I got chills. And then I said, who wants to, like, we're almost done the curriculum. Who wants to stay after? And we'll talk about this. And every
Mm,
parent stayed. And these are busy parents.
mm,
Every single parent stayed. And that was the beginning of me saying, I need to write this book. Right? I
mm,
need to help people if my childhood wasn't normative, right? Because if you think about our attachment system, we're supposed to just copy what our parents did. Like, that's literally how our brain is wired, like, do what mom did.
mm,
But what
mhm.
if what mom did wasn't great for whatever reason? Or what if there was no mom, right? What if there was no
Mhm.
dad? Then what? Or childhood was great, but then there was this horrible toxic divorce. Then there was, like, complete economic upheaval during COVID, and everything of your family shifted in horrible major ways. And now you're just entirely depleted. And you can't
Mhm.
even begin to think about what your experiences your kids need because you're so depleted right now. Like, you're so emotionally on edge right now. There has to be a moment of, like, restoration. What's important in parenting? What's not? How do we get to doing the important things because we do want to be the parent we're dreaming of being, right? And
So
that's the
so
journey.
how do you restore yourself when you feel so depleted?
So it's a journey, right? But one of the ways we restore ourselves is by getting support from other post traumatic parents. And that's why I have the online post traumatic parenting community, like on Instagram, on YouTube, where people can actually get the information, and also support one another, right? Interact with one another and give each other ideas.
Mhm.
Parenting classes really helps. There's also this, like, misnomer for parents who are doing it on their own, this idea that you have to do quote unquote self care.
Mhm.
So, self care, when people talk about self care, they tell me, I do so much self care, it's not that. Very often, they don't understand that what they're actually doing is a combination of what I call self maintenance and anesthesia,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Self care, self maintenance is all the healthy things you do. You go to the dentist, you go to the gym, maybe you take yoga, maybe you go for a walk in nature, maybe you eat your quinoa, whatever it is, right? That's not self care. That's self-maintenance. It keeps the engine that is your body running. And, like, Netflix with a glass of wine, also not self-care. It's anesthesia. It's had a space out. I'm not
mhm,
anti-anesthesia. Every so often, I've been known to restore my mood. Like, a patient just told me something really heavy, and I'll watch a funny cat video to, like, restore myself and laugh a little so that, like, I can sort of clear my mental palate and move on to the next patient, right? Anesthesia is
mhm,
fine, but
mhm,
that's also not self care. Self
mhm,
care is a joy experience that reconnects you to yourself. And what I always say to parents is self care is childcare. If you're like, I need to go to my painting class and I'm leaving my
mhm,
kids, and my little 2-year-old is like, Mommy, no, only mommy. And you feel so guilty because how could I leave him? No, by going, you are actually caring for him. You are restoring
mhm,
yourself. You're making a mother for your child, or you're making a father for your child. You're doing that in order so that you come back and you can bring your whole self to parenting,
mhm.
right? So we have to really re-understand self-care. I also believe that whether you're in therapy or not, if you're a post-traumatic parent and your inner child talks to you a lot, it's really a good idea to journal, to get that out, right? To have that dialogue, whether you're just talking into your phone. Like, journal doesn't have to mean like a pretty diary that's leather bound with a pen, right? You can talk
Mhm.
into your phone, you can, talk into a webcam, you can write it down. You have many options. But the idea of, if your inner child has something to say to you, hear it out. And if you need more
Right.
help with that, get a therapist to help you with that. But there
Hmm.
is support. There is a way of doing it. There is a way of pausing and saying, wait, I just want to do it differently.
Hmm. Wow. What role does your religious background, your Torah education, what role does that play in in your practice or in your own life, in your personal life, to give you inspiration and to give you guidance?
So I think it plays a role into the fact that I have values, right? And I very much talk about parenting in accordance with your values. Now, many members of the post traumatic parenting community are not religious, right? Because sadly, unfortunately, having had a difficult childhood that you have to, like, recover from cuts across every single culture and every single group imaginable. But I do believe that having values and knowing what you value, whether they're my values or not, but really parenting in accordance with those values gives you a sense of clarity and purpose. And I know for myself,
Can
knowing my
yeah, give us an
values
ex
gave that to
can you
me.
give us an example from yourself, from your own life? Like, what would be a Torah value that you feel is so important in your own parenting journey?
So, for sure, the value of communicating with others with respect, right?
Mhm,
So that value, like, right? So if my children are fighting, my first question is not about the content of the fight. My first question is, are we going to have a good fight right now? Are we going to uphold the
Mhm.
value of communicating with respect? Because you can tell me about the problem that your little brother, went into your briefcase and stole your treat that was yours, and not call him the meanest stealer in the whole entire world and I hate you, right? Like, there is a way of telling me about that problem and telling him about that problem respectfully. I get it. You're
Mhm.
so mad, right?
Mhm.
I would be too.
Mhm.
That is a very big problem. If I had a treat that I got from my teacher because I finished a contest and my little brother ate it, not that I have a little brother, but I have big brothers, right? Like, I would not be very happy. You are so allowed to be happy. And this is that dichotomy, right? Which is, I think, a very Jewish one of like, it's not the emotion. You're allowed to have your emotions. It's what you do with it,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And what you
Mhm.
do with it, like therein lies, and if you want to speak in Jewish terms, your bechira, right? Your humanity, your essential free will, right? The
Mhm.
emotion cannot make you do something. When my kids say like I'm angry, I always make them restate that, right? I am me. I am feeling angry, right? Angry is not
Mhm.
who you are. Angry is how you feel. You're allowed to feel angry. You're a human who feels angry, right? That just informs my way of thinking. I think it's very consistent with the Torah. It's very consistent in psychology. But I know for me, it was always so helpful to have those decision trees of values, right? Should I do this or that? Well, if this is something that's not consistent with my values, I don't even have to worry about it. Like it's
Mhm.
great. It's just not mine, right? It's not important to
Mhm.
me. So it helps. So that very much I think is reflected in the book. This idea of parenting towards your values. It's also obviously in acceptance and commitment therapy. Like, I didn't make up the idea of parenting in accordance to your values, but for me, it's such a comforting like lodestone to go towards. Like, was I going towards my values now? Great. So the
Mhm.
fact that it wasn't comfortable or it didn't go exactly as planned, but I still acted consistently with my values. It's fine.
And how do you convey that to your children in a way that they'll understand your values and will want to mirror your values?
So in the book, we have a whole chapter on making a parenting mission statement and a family mission statement and setting that together with your kids so that everybody bought into that mission. So it can only be a family mission if it's everybody's mission. Like
Mhm.
communicating with respect, for example, is one of those values, right, for our family. The idea that we're all going to sit down and we're going to talk about our values and we're going to ask ourselves, is what we're doing consistent with our values or not?
Mhm.
Is just super important. Your children are not going to be clones of you, right? They're not always going to take on every single one of your values, and that's fine, right? Because
Mhm.
I think every human is in this world to figure out their own journey and their own values and what's important to them. And I think it's risky to expect our children to just conform, right? Like
Mhm.
it feels a little threatening, right? Because it's like, wait, if this is my value, not your like really, like you don't believe in this, okay, right? But
Mhm.
then again, they're their own humans, right? And one of the things we learn about in the book, I also talk about this idea of boundaries and the idea that every human exists in an independent reality outside of our own, right? So everybody's going to do those things slightly differently.
Mhm.
To give like a personal example, I am not a Susie homemaker type, like by any stretch of the imagination. I cook, but like I cook in a lot of bulk. I freeze a lot. I'm very efficient. I don't bake challah because I don't have time. I work Fridays. I'm a child psychologist. I work when the kids are off. So I tend to work Sunday afternoons, Friday afternoons, right? Evenings. So I just don't have that kind of time. And I always joke with my kids, I have a deal with the local bakery. He doesn't treat patients. I don't bake challah. My daughters both bake challah, right? And they're very, very much into it, right? And for me, it's like, oh, did you feel a lack that I didn't?
Mhm.
But it's a beautiful thing. They are free to explore their heritage in their way, and they're free to emphasize what's important in their parenting. And I'm
Mhm.
free to emphasize what's important in my parenting, right? And the more secure you are in yourself, the more tolerant you are of differences and the less scary differences are. I find that
Mhm.
parents who are very insecure get very upset if their child in any way deviates from them. Right. And
Mhm.
now, of course, I'm not talking about when a child's being self destructive or doing something dangerous, that's different. But I mean, like when your child is deviating in some way from like what you value, it does feel a little bit like, ooh, but then again, that's such a beautiful thing. That means you created a human who has a mind of their own and is going to, grapple with the same realities as you and come to slightly different decisions. Wow.
Mhm.
That means they're a
Mhm.
fully autonomous human. That's amazing.
Right, and they're also on their own journey, like we're all on our own
Right.
journey of our own soul journey. You mentioned your children. Can I ask how many children you have?
So we don't really count children, but like
Okay.
it rounds up to 10.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. So how do you juggle everything? How do you juggle being and how do you juggle the intense sessions that you must be having as a clinical psychologist with dealing with trauma. It could be very heavy. How do you juggle that and bring it home to your come home to your own children and have the headspace to parent them?
So I don't think you juggle, right? I think we say juggle and like it's a misnomer. I think what we do is like we sort of code switch, right? We go from one thing to another, and
Mhm,
we have to do that. For me personally, and I have some of this in the book. I feel like I should talk about this more. I do a lot to systematize like the mental load of parenting, and to like I said, like in August when my practice is pretty quiet, a lot of my patients are in camp. I'm not consulting in schools. I don't have many speaking engagements. That's when like I fill my freezer. I have how many freezers? 5?
mhm.
Think something like that in my house. So
Wow.
like I will just like cook and freeze in gigantic bulk. My house just looks like a factory. So I will do things like that. I figure out the menu of the suppers of the week on Sunday.
Mm,
So and then I cook it like cook the side dishes, right? Because like the main dish is coming out of the freezer, but I'll have to cook the sides or whatever. Like, and the kids know we actually post it on the fridge. Everyone talks about it. That way we don't have the yuck, whatever. If they don't like what I made, you can just come to me and politely ask for your alternative protein plan and go do that. As long as I don't have to, if want an alternative protein, the deal is it's yours from start to finish. You want to scramble yourself an egg, you have to scramble it, throw out the eggshell, put the frying pan in the dishwasher, clean up after yourself. But sure, you can scramble yourself an egg, no problem, or take a bowl of cottage cheese or whatever the choice is. As long as you don't come in and say, yuck, what's for supper? Then we have another conversation because that's not communicating with respect. Um, but the idea is like whatever I can systematize, I systematize. My husband and I sit down and like figure out like who, the orthodontist, the practices, like we just figure out the schedule. I'm lucky that my husband does not view that as like somehow babysitting, or, it's just like we are
mm,
both parents. So we're going to both
mhm,
figure out the mental load together. Um, I very much try that if something does not take a PhD in psychology, or your mommy doesn't have to do that with you, then it is not my job. Like
mhm,
the cleaners can iron shirts better than me, right?
mhm,
So like anything like that, even if, perhaps I could economize by ironing the shirts myself, but my time is it's just not worth it. So I've learned to
mhm,
like cut down and cut down and cut down. I keep things very basic when it comes to like entertaining in my house. Like I'm not a fashion influencer. I'm not a
mhm,
lifestyle influencer. Like I just don't care. Like if I'm gonna bake, it's gonna be chocolate chip cookies. Everybody likes them. They're easy. It's a forgiving recipe. Move on.
mhm, mhm,
Um, so it's things like that in terms of the mental load, really figuring out how to juggle it, because then I'd rather parent when I'm parenting. Like when my kids come home from school, I don't want to be cooking while I'm doing homework with them. I want to be like focusing on doing homework with them.
mhm,
So it's a matter of really logically sitting down and figuring out like what works in your life and what doesn't work in your life, and then figuring out what can you systematize, eliminate, right? What can you do in advance, all of that kind of stuff. In terms of like the heavy things I hear and like, transitioning back to parenting. So for me, this is my own neurology. I very much have rules. I have days that I see patients, and those are not days that I write or do things like, shoot content for YouTube or for the podcast or anything like that. Um, when I'm seeing patients, I am very much Dr. Koslowitz. And on those days, I can't come upstairs to my regular life until I've done like a transition ritual. So I have to sort of put it aside, put it in a box, do something to restore myself, and come upstairs. So I do have one very long clinical day, and I have a babysitter that day. So that way, because I'd rather do that than have to transition so many times. So
mhm,
like my one long day, that day, like somebody else is doing the parenting, and, it's pizza night, and that's the way we do it that one night. And the trade-off is I don't have that on other days of the week, right?
mhm,
So I need the space. In other words, I need to create the space to transition back into
mhm,
life. And I'm lucky to be at the point in my practice now where I do have associates, I do have a team. I'm not at the stage. I have things that I don't do, right? I don't treat, for example, suicidal patients because
mhm,
I can't be on call 24/7.
mhm.
So anything that would require that level of attention, I wish I could help, but it's not for me. Like I'm not at that stage of my life right now.
Right, right. So I guess it goes according to stages, but it sounds like you're a very hands-on mom despite, and you're definitely what we would call the akara tabayit, the mainstay of the home despite everything that you do.
I truly value parenting. Like, it's very important to me. I value parenting more than I value having a gorgeously organized playroom. And I value
Mhm.
parenting more than I value experimenting with new recipes, right? Like, these are just things. And for some people, if that sparks joy and that's your self care and that makes you feel like you, like, go do it. I
Mhm.
just refuse to feel inferior when I don't do those things. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's
Well,
just
that's a
like,
great
yeah,
attitude. That's
yeah.
definitely a great attitude.
I know what I'm good at. I know what I'm not good at. But I also have a very hands-on husband, so I'm very lucky. We both value parenting very much. So
Mhm.
I'm very lucky because I do have that type of support.
Mhm. Well, with 10 children, you gotta have that,
Right,
right?
right.
Okay. Wow, that's incredible. You also said that trauma could actually become your superpower, and I want you to talk a little about that because there's a concept in Hasidus that it's through Yisron Ha'or al Choshech, that it's the advantage of the light is through the darkness. And I think that's a little bit of what you're saying, that it's the darkness itself that provides the light, or provides the advantage of the light. And is that what you're saying about the trauma of the the parenting with a trauma could actually become your superpower? What does that mean?
So I don't it's not only parenting, it's really all trauma is your superpower in many
Right.
ways. I think the idea is that, look, if you think about trauma, what's trauma really? It's an instance of learning that is extremely effective, right? And when we're traumatized, a trauma app in our brain is born, and the trauma app exists to sort of keep us alive. And it's going to do whatever it takes. It's going to co opt every psychological resource we have to keep us alive, which means it's going to teach us some very good skills. So, for example, if somebody's badly bullied and maybe being raised by a stepmom who's, critical, she might learn to be a people pleaser. In order to be a
Mm,
people pleaser, she might really learn how to read other people's faces and body language. She can read a
mhm,
room and a situation way before anybody else has figured out what's going on, right? Now, if you can co-opt that, if you can continue to have that wisdom of being able to read a room and really resonate with what other people are feeling without being trapped by the need to fix it, you have a superpower there, right?
mm,
You've trained
mhm,
yourself into a skill, a perception that other humans just don't have. That's what a superpower is. So trauma does that. Trauma really teaches you how to do something really, really, really well. And if you can just use the good parts of that rather than being sort of imprisoned by the bad parts of that, I really do have this belief that there's no such thing as a personality. Your personality is really a series of trauma responses, like behaviors you've trained yourself to do over and over again. And we know how our brain works with neuroplasticity. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more you do something, the more you train yourself into doing it. So if someone's like, I'm an introvert, well, maybe it's true that you recharge when you're away from other humans and you like solitary intellectual pursuits, perhaps. But how much of that is the social world hasn't been very rewarding,
mm,
right? And if the social world hasn't been very rewarding, perhaps we can teach you to make it more rewarding. Like, I am an introvert, like in the sense that I'm shy by nature. I'm somewhat socially anxious. I was awkward as a little kid in school. I know about bullying because I was bullied. So, like, I that is my nature. And I still am happiest if I'm just like researching and writing at a computer, like away from other humans. Like, it's a joy experience for me. But at the same token, I can communicate and appear confident. I have the social skills to live in a world of other humans and not be overwhelmed by it. So
mhm,
anything you don't like in your personality, rather than just being like, well, it's my personality, Myers Briggs says so,
mhm,
you learned that somewhere. Partially, your brain was already pre programmed to learn it, but partially, you learned that somewhere. What you can learn, you can unlearn. What
mhm.
you can learn a new lesson for, right? And that's what therapy is, right? We relearn.
But it just seems like you're not saying to unlearn it, you're saying to learn how to use it in a great way, like you're using it as your superpower, so you can now use that for tremendous great things.
Well, unlearn that it's an emergency and you must do this every
Ah,
single
okay.
time, right? So
Right.
your boss tells you, "Oh, can you please stay late and do this?" And your empathy-based superpower is telling you, like, "Oh my gosh, she's stressed out. Then she's going to be mad at me. I don't. If I say no, she'll be like stomping around the office
Mhm,
tomorrow." And you are right about all of those things. You are reading her right, and you can still say, I really want you to get the best of me, not the rest of me. So I need to leave at
mhm,
5. I will come in tomorrow and work on it first thing. Or
mhm,
I could stay another hour, but I am going to have to be paid time and a half because I need to pay a babysitter for that extra hour. Whatever you're going to say, you can use that superpower. You can say it kindly. You can be like, I see you're so stressed out about this brief that you need. I
mm,
get that it's so hard. and it is 5 o'clock, and that's when I leave. So here are your
Mm,
choices, right? And if
mm,
you can do that, you're using the superpower of like, I see your emotions. I get that you're stressed. I'm accurately predicting that you're going to be somewhat, unkind tomorrow. Like all of that is true, but it doesn't mean I have to,
mhm.
right?
Absolutely, for sure. So I always wonder, some of our parents have gone through, or our ancestors have gone through such difficulties. My mother was in Russia. There were people who were Holocaust survivors. And yet, you know, they don't talk about life the way, yet we talk about being traumatized because someone looked at us in the wrong way.
Right.
Are we less resilient as a generation? Like, why are we talking so much about trauma and so much about our needs? Or is this just something that we are more aware of?
I don't think we're less resilient. I think the resilience has a different flavor. I do think that there was something lost in the generation that, in the generation that didn't acknowledge their emotions, right? And
Mhm,
many of them were very productive and did wonderful things, but it really showed in their parenting and it showed in their family life, right? And they weren't very happy, joyful people sometimes. And that was hard
mhm,
sometimes for their kids. I think that what we want is more than resilience is fortitude, right? That real ability to face a challenge in life and handle it well, right? That being said, you know, are there some things the flavor of it is different, right? Like it's not like, oh my gosh, a mob of people, intent on killing me was just pursuing me. It's like my boss just threw this on my desk at 5 o'clock. But the sensation of, oh my gosh, what do I do right now? Right, does feel the same. The question is,
mhm,
convincing your nervous system that, nobody's standing over you with a knife, it's just a boss that you have to say no to, right? I think
mhm.
that's, a little bit different. I think that,
But
you
are
know
we too coddled as a generation? What do you think?
I don't really think so. I just think we're more aware of it and more willing to talk about it. And
Mhm,
I think that we what we have to do, if you look at that generation, I have this sometimes from the older generation when they'll say to me like, you talk to kids too much about emotions. Like in my time, we didn't have emotions. The thing is like if you don't have emotions, emotions have you. Because you do
mm,
have
mhm,
emotions, right? You
mhm,
have to learn how to deal with your emotions in a way where it serves you.
mhm,
But that being said, it's hard. Like I was actually on NPR today and they were talking about how, maybe it's because the generation of adulting is hard is now saying parenting is so hard. Adulting is
mhm.
hard. I always say
Right.
adulting is really hard if you never childed. And and parenting is adulting on steroids, right? That's what
Right.
parenting is. I am the adult now and I'm going to adult the world for you. But hard doesn't mean bad. I think
Mhm,
somehow that's the big difference that this generation got, that somehow hard is bad. Hard is just hard.
mm, mhm,
Nothing worthwhile in the world ever came other than through hard work and effort. The hard things are meant to be hard, but that doesn't mean they're bad, right?
mhm.
So,
So you think that we expect things to be just
we
easy?
expect it to be easy and joyful. It's going to be
Mhm,
hard and
mhm,
valuable and beautiful and worthwhile, right? But it's not necessarily going to be easy in the moment. And also,
mhm.
you're not gonna see your progress right away, right? You're gonna see your progress in the patterns, like, "Wow, it's been a few weeks and I haven't yelled," right? You're not gonna suddenly like no bells are ringing from on high saying like, "Ding, ding, 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 you didn't yell just now," right? It's like a
Mhm,
few weeks later, you're like, "Wow, I got through that entire midwinter break with my kids and we did not have one fight."
mhm,
It's that kind of thing where the progress sneaks up on you, so you don't necessarily see it. And I think also this is a generation that pays more attention to our parenting, our emotional well-being, how things feel more than ever before. So we are constantly taking our temperature, right?
mhm,
We're not just keeping on and carrying on, which was the previous generation. We are like, wait, am I doing it right? Wait, should it be feeling this hard? But yeah, parenting's supposed to be hard. It's not meant to
hmm,
be easy. Nothing
mhm.
worthwhile is ever easy.
Oh, 100%. What do you do as a religious Jewish woman when you want inspiration? Like, is there any Torah teachings that inspire you, that come to mind, that you feel excited about, that you feel passionate about?
So not like it's not like I go to, like, one thing in particular. I think one thing that I really like to do is very mindfully study with my kids, like, when I'm doing homework with them or whatever, like, to sometimes, like, explore beyond what their teacher taught or, beyond what happened. My daughter's school has this whole Masilas Yesharim curriculum, so, learning that with them, even from the lens of, like, a second grader and the lens of, like, an eighth grader, that and having these really deep conversations about the meaning of life like you'd be surprised that a second grader can, but they really can. I find
Mhm.
that extremely meaningful. Like that's just something that for me is like, wow, this is so fun that we get to do this. This is so cool.
Mm.
Your teacher said, like, and my kids will come home and be like, Mommy, you're not gonna believe what my teacher said. You're gonna love it. Like they save up those nuggets for me, 'cause it's like it's
Mhm.
been a long time since I did eighth grade. So I really want to hear. Oh,
Right. I
yeah.
guess that's parenting yourself because maybe you didn't get that when you were young or is
When I
or
was
not?
young, my father was very focused on academic excellence, and I was very focused on making my father happy. So I think I was studying more for the 100 than for anything
Mhm.
else. Like it was very important for me to be a straight A student. So you do lose a little bit of the joy of like, what is the teacher actually saying when you're just trying to memorize it for the test.
Mhm.
So it's a little bit different.
100%.
Yeah,
Right. Wow. And last question, because I know our time is running
time's
out, but
running
thank
out.
you. Yeah. What's your goals and dreams for the future? For our world, for yourself?
So I think the next thing I'm personally excited about, because I'm so busy with launching the book, it really did feel like the world's longest pregnancy, like just the whole
Right.
experience of writing it and getting it out there into the world. I'm going to be hosting a summit probably in like April, where if people pre-order the book, they get to hear from a whole bunch of thought leaders, a couple of days worth. So I'm super excited to interview all the people that are going to be on the summit because I just really want to hear from experts on like the interest. Now that we're naming this problem of post-traumatic parenting, I want to hear from these really wise people and their perspectives on it. So that's like
Mm,
my next like super exciting, like super fun project. So I think that it's like hard for me to think about, anything other than the launching of the book at this point, simply because
mhm.
it's so present in my mind.
Right,
Right.
beautiful. Well, I wish you a lot of success, and I hope our world is less traumatized. I hope the people of our world is less traumatized
Yeah, that's the
so that
goal.
we can all reach our true goal and our true potential.
Yep. My goal always is working myself out of a job, like, right when I can discharge someone from therapy, when someone's like, "Okay, I think I got this parenting thing down pat, like, I'm good." Like, this is this is a real feeling of achievement with them. Yeah.
100%. 100%. Thank you so much for joining us and wishing you continued success in all your important work of healing the world and healing parents and healing people and healing children.
Thanks so much for having me.
Wow, I found that very interesting, that interview with Dr. Koslowitz. I found it very fascinating to hear what caused her to become the clinical psychologist she is today and how she's so helpful to so many people, especially people in the religious and Torah observant community, and how she felt she wanted to be the person that she would have loved to have at that time, going through what she did with her whole trauma of her father passing away in her arms, which must have been such a difficult experience, as well as the aneurysm of her friend that she experienced very soon after. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I thought she gave a lot of very important tips and information on how to parent and how to actually cause our trauma to become our superpower. I loved how she explained that, how we can use what has caused us such pain to learn from it and to not only learn from it, but actually to learn it and to use it as something that now we are so proficient in that we have a superpower that we can use in a positive way. I also really enjoyed how she explained about parenting our children and how when we parent our children and give to our children, we are really healing ourselves and healing those parts of ourselves that didn't have or that were lacking in those areas. And that is, of course, so in tune with Hasidic understanding and Torah philosophy of giving to another person. And through the giving that we do to others, we really heal ourselves. So I wonder what you enjoyed about this interview and what did you learn about it, about tr- parenting with trauma or any other area really of parenting that you could really apply to yourself or any insight that you got from this interview. I'd love to hear it. If you are not subscribed, please make sure that you do subscribe to Chabad.org/extraordinary. Like us. We love to hear your comments. We're on all platforms where podcasts are shown. And you can view us there on the go or when you're doing something in the house. Thank you for listening. And thank you so much for being part of this extraordinary community.